The guests thought the bride was running away from her future. The truth was, she was running toward someone else's. The doors to the ballroom opened slowly as soft piano music filled the air. Hundreds of guests rose to their feet. Phones lifted. Smiles appeared. White roses lined the aisle like a path leading toward a dream that had taken years to build. Naomi Brooks stood just beyond the doorway, holding a bouquet of ivory flowers against her chest. Her wedding dress shimmered beneath the golden lights. For a moment, everything felt exactly as she had imagined. The music, the crowd, the anticipation, the future waiting only a few steps away. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath. 7 years. 7 years of extra shifts. 7 years of saving money one paycheck at a time. 7 years of believing this day would finally arrive. Then she heard it. At first it sounded like a cough somewhere near the reception tables. Nothing unusual. The music continued. The guests remained smiling. Then another sound followed. Sharper this time. More urgent. A chair scraped across the floor. Someone gasped. Another guest stood up suddenly. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Naomi opened her eyes. Confusion spread through the ballroom like a ripple moving across water. Voices replaced laughter. A woman called out for help. Several people turned toward a table near the back of the room. The music stopped. Silence lasted only a second before dozens of conversations erupted at once. Naomi stepped forward and looked beyond the doorway. Near a table marked 12, an older man appeared to be struggling. Guests surrounded him, but nobody seemed to know what to do. Some stared. Some panicked. Others simply froze. A wedding coordinator rushed toward Naomi. "Do not worry," she said nervously. "Someone will handle it." But Naomi was already moving. She handed her bouquet to a stunned bridesmaid and stepped into the crowd. "Naomi," someone called. "The ceremony is starting." She never turned around. Her wedding dress swept across the marble floor as she pushed between guests. The farther she moved from the aisle, the quieter the room seemed to become. At the altar, her fiancé watched in disbelief. Family members exchanged confused looks. Nobody understood what was happening. Naomi reached the crowded table and saw the man clearly for the first time. Silver hair, expensive suit, a luxury watch resting against his wrist. He looked like someone accustomed to control. Yet in that moment he looked exactly like everyone else. Vulnerable. Human. Naomi dropped to her knees beside him. The ballroom disappeared. The wedding disappeared. The cameras, the flowers, the carefully planned schedule all disappeared. Nothing mattered except the person in front of her. Around them, hundreds of people watched. Some whispered. Some stared. Nobody moved. Naomi focused only on helping. Calm. Steady. Certain. She did not know his name. Did not know his profession. Did not know that he was one of the wealthiest men in America. She only knew someone needed help. What Naomi could not possibly know was that the choice she made during the next few moments would end one chapter of her life before it ever began and open another she never imagined existed. While hotel staff surrounded the older man and guests slowly began to understand that the situation was under control, Naomi remained beside him until she was certain he no longer needed her help. Only then did she step back. The ballroom felt different now. The music had stopped. Conversations filled every corner of the room. Guests whispered. Some looked concerned. Others looked confused. A few simply stared at the bride who had walked away from her own ceremony without hesitation. Naomi barely noticed any of them. Her heart was still racing. Not because she regretted what she had done. Because she knew nothing about what would happen next. She quietly retrieved her bouquet from a bridesmaid and moved toward a hallway away from the crowd. For the first time all day, she was alone. The silence felt strange. Just minutes earlier, she had been preparing to begin a new chapter of her life. Now she sat in a small room beside the ballroom, staring at a few loose flower petals resting on her lap. If someone had told Naomi years ago that her wedding day would unfold this way, she never would have believed them. Nothing in her life had come easily. She grew up in a modest apartment on the east side of Charleston with her mother, Gloria Brooks. Money was always limited. Opportunities were often scarce. Yet her mother taught her something she never forgot. Character mattered most when nobody was watching. By 16, Naomi was working after school. By 19, she was helping pay rent. By 22, she was balancing restaurant shifts while caring for her mother after a serious health condition made everyday tasks more difficult. Friends often wondered how she stayed positive. Naomi rarely had an answer. She simply kept moving forward. Every challenge became another reason to work harder. Another reason to remain grateful. Years earlier, while serving tables during a busy lunch rush, she met Daniel Parker. He was a middle school teacher with an easy smile and endless patience. Unlike many people, Daniel never focused on what Naomi lacked. He noticed her determination, her kindness, her ability to make people feel important. Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, through long workdays, family responsibilities, and countless small sacrifices. When Daniel proposed near Charleston Harbor 2 years earlier, Naomi cried before she could even answer. This wedding represented more than a ceremony. It represented years of effort, years of hope, years of believing better days were ahead. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. One of her bridesmaids stepped inside. "Everyone is asking about you," she said softly. Naomi nodded but said nothing. Through the closed door, she could still hear distant voices from the ballroom. The celebration had paused. The future she had planned suddenly felt uncertain. Naomi looked down at her bouquet. Another white petal drifted loose and landed on the floor. Such a small thing. Yet somehow it felt important. What she did not know was that the stranger she had helped only minutes earlier was already beginning to wonder who she was, and why she had chosen a complete stranger over the most important day of her own life. Across the hotel, the man Naomi had helped was sitting alone inside a private lounge reserved for conference guests. Physician had already checked on him. Hotel managers had stopped by. Assistants had called repeatedly. Yet none of those conversations held his attention for very long. His thoughts kept returning to the bride. His name was Edward Harrington. Most Americans knew that name. They had seen it in business magazines, financial reports, and television interviews. Edward was one of the wealthiest technology entrepreneurs in the country. His companies employed thousands of people. His investments shaped industries. His decisions moved markets. Yet despite the influence attached to his name, very few people knew the man behind it. At 58 years old, Edward had spent decades building a business empire from almost nothing. There had been years when success seemed impossible. Years when he worked from tiny offices with outdated equipment and unpaid bills stacked on every available surface. He sacrificed weekends, holidays, relationships, time. Eventually, the sacrifices paid off. Success arrived, then wealth, then influence. But success carried a cost. Over time, Edward noticed that people treated him differently. Conversations changed the moment they learned who he was. Some wanted opportunities. Some wanted access. Others wanted money. Genuine interactions became increasingly rare. That was why he often traveled quietly whenever possible. Earlier that afternoon, he had arrived at the Charleston Hotel without media attention or public announcements. He was scheduled to attend a private investment conference the following morning. His plan had been simple: review documents, have dinner, rest. Instead, he found himself seated near a wedding celebration he never intended to witness. During dinner, he occasionally glanced toward the ballroom entrance. Families laughed together. Friends posed for photographs. Children chased each other between tables until parents called them back. The atmosphere reminded him of something he had not experienced in years. Simplicity, real happiness. At one point, he noticed a young bride greeting guests. Even from a distance, she seemed more focused on everyone else than herself. Edward remembered thinking she looked unusually calm for someone about to get married. Then he returned to his tablet and thought nothing more about it. Now, hours later, he found himself remembering every detail. The way she moved through the crowd. The way she ignored the attention around her. The way she acted without hesitation. Most importantly, she never asked who he was. She never asked what he did. She never asked if he could reward her. She helped because someone needed help. Nothing more. Edward stared out the window overlooking Charleston Harbor. The evening sun reflected across the water in shades of gold and silver. For perhaps the first time in many years, he felt something unexpected. Humility. Because a woman he had never met had reminded him of something wealth often hides. Character reveals itself in moments when there is nothing to gain. And somewhere inside the same hotel, the bride who had changed the course of his evening was sitting alone, completely unaware that one of the most powerful men in America could not stop wondering who she was. The ballroom never fully recovered. Even after the emergency had passed and guests returned to their seats, something had changed. The carefully planned rhythm of the evening was gone. Conversations drifted in uncertain directions. Laughter became quieter. The celebration felt suspended between what had happened and what might happen next. Naomi remained in the bridal suite while family members, wedding coordinators, and close friends tried to decide whether the ceremony should continue. Outside the room, opinions multiplied. Some guests admired what she had done. Others questioned it. A few quietly wondered whether anyone should walk away from their own wedding, regardless of the circumstances. Naomi ignored all of it. She sat beside the window watching dark clouds gather beyond the harbor. A soft knock interrupted the silence. This time it was her mother. Gloria entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. One she handed to Naomi, the other she kept for herself. Neither spoke at first. The room felt too heavy for small talk. After several moments, Gloria finally smiled. "You look exactly like your grandmother when she made up her mind about something." Naomi laughed softly despite everything. "I am not sure that is a compliment." "Trust me," Gloria replied. "It is." They sat together listening to distant voices from the ballroom. Eventually Naomi lowered her eyes toward the untouched coffee. "Do you think I ruined everything?" The question lingered in the air. Gloria answered without hesitation. "No." Naomi looked up. "Really?" Her mother nodded. "I think life gave you a difficult choice, and you chose who you are." Tears threatened to form in Naomi's eyes. Before she could respond, another knock came at the door. This one felt different, more hesitant. Gloria immediately understood and quietly left the room. A moment later, Daniel Parker stepped inside. He was still wearing the suit he had chosen months earlier. The tie was slightly loosened now. His expression carried exhaustion more than anger. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel sat across from her. "Everyone keeps asking me what happens next," he said quietly. Naomi stared down at her bouquet. "I wish I knew." Daniel nodded. The answer felt honest. He studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "If the same thing happened tomorrow, would you do it again?" Naomi did not need time to think. "Yes." The answer arrived immediately. Daniel looked toward the floor and smiled sadly. "That is what I thought." Silence returned. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the hotel windows. Naomi suddenly realized the question had never really been about the stranger. It was about understanding the person she had always been. Daniel knew that better than anyone. "You care about people," he said, "even when it costs you something." Naomi felt tears forming now. Not because he was criticizing her, because he understood her completely. Somewhere else in the hotel, Edward Harrington was preparing to leave for the evening. Somewhere inside the ballroom, guests continued discussing the bride who chose a stranger over her own ceremony. And somewhere beyond the rain-covered windows, consequences neither Naomi nor Daniel could yet imagine were already beginning to move toward them. The rain continued long after most of the guests had left the hotel. By midnight, workers were quietly removing decorations, folding chairs, and gathering centerpieces that only hours earlier had symbolized a celebration. Now they looked like reminders of a day that had unfolded differently than anyone expected. Naomi sat alone in her small apartment, still wearing part of her wedding attire beneath a gray sweater. Her bouquet rested on the kitchen table beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Across the room, Gloria slept in an armchair, exhausted from the emotional weight of the evening. Naomi wished she could sleep too. Instead, She stared out the window at the rain sliding down the glass. Her phone buzzed throughout the night. Friends checked on her. Family members offered encouragement. A few guests shared opinions she never asked for. She ignored most of the messages. Her mind remained fixed on everything that had happened inside the ballroom. The stranger, Daniel, the uncertainty, the feeling that her future had somehow shifted without warning. Across Charleston Harbor, Edward Harrington sat inside the study of his waterfront estate. A stack of reports waited on his desk. Important emails filled his inbox. None of them mattered. His thoughts continued returning to the bride. Finally, shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, he picked up his phone and called his chief of staff. The woman answered immediately. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Edward walked toward the window overlooking the dark harbor. "I need information about someone." A brief silence followed. "At this hour?" Edward smiled faintly. "It cannot wait until morning." Within hours, a small team began gathering publicly available information. Nothing invasive, nothing improper, just enough to identify the woman who had helped him. By sunrise, a file sat on Edward's desk. He opened it slowly. Naomi Brooks, 29 years old, waitress, Charleston resident, caregiver to her mother, volunteer at community events. No history of seeking publicity. No history of asking powerful people for favors. Edward continued reading. The deeper he looked, the quieter he became. Every page revealed another sacrifice, another responsibility, another reason she could have chosen herself instead of a stranger. Yet she had not. She had walked away from the moment she had spent years preparing for because someone needed help. Edward closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Wealth had introduced him to thousands of people over the years. Very few had impressed him. Naomi Brooks had done so without even trying. He looked once more at the harbor beyond the glass. Dawn was beginning to spread across the water in shades of gold and pale blue. Then he reached for the phone again. "Arrange transportation," he said. "For this morning." His chief of staff hesitated. "What exactly would you like us to do?" Edward glanced toward Naomi's file. A faint smile appeared on his face. "I would like to thank her properly." Meanwhile, Naomi finally drifted asleep on the couch as sunlight slowly entered the apartment. She had no idea that a long black limousine was already moving through the Charleston streets toward her neighborhood, carrying an invitation that would change everything. Naomi woke to the sound of knocking somewhere below her apartment window. At first she ignored it. The previous day still felt like a dream she had not fully escaped. The wedding, the hotel, the stranger, Daniel. Every memory seemed wrapped in a fog of exhaustion. Then came another knock. Louder this time. Gloria was already standing near the front window. She pulled the curtain aside and immediately froze. "Naomi," she said quietly, "you should come look at this." Naomi walked across the room, still wearing the sweater she had slept in. The moment she reached the window, she stopped. Parked directly in front of the building sat a long black limousine. Its polished exterior reflected the morning sunlight. Several neighbors had already gathered outside. Curtains moved in nearby apartments. A teenager across the street pointed openly at the vehicle. Nobody in this neighborhood owned a limousine. Naomi blinked twice, convinced she was still half asleep. "What is that doing here?" Gloria smiled. "I was hoping you could tell me." A few moments later, another knock sounded at the apartment door. Naomi opened it cautiously. A tall man wearing a tailored navy suit stood in the hallway. His posture was professional. His expression was polite. "Miss Naomi Brooks?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Yes." The man extended a business card. "My name is Thomas Reynolds. I represent Mr. Edward Harrington." The name immediately sounded familiar. Then everything clicked into place. The stranger from the hotel. Naomi looked from the card to the man and back again. "There must be some mistake." Thomas shook his head. "No mistake, Miss Brooks." He reached into a leather folder and removed a sealed envelope. "Mr. Harrington asked me to deliver this personally." Naomi carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. The paper was simple. The handwriting was elegant. She began reading. Miss Brooks, yesterday you gave up something important to help someone you did not know. Most people spend their lives talking about character. You demonstrated it. I would be grateful for the opportunity to thank you in person. Respectfully, Edward Harrington. Naomi read the message twice. Then a third time. The words felt sincere. Not corporate. Not rehearsed. Sincere. Gloria stepped closer and glanced at the note. Well, she said softly. That is certainly unexpected. Naomi laughed nervously. That might be the understatement of the century. Thomas remained patient. Mr. Harrington has invited you to visit his estate this morning. Transportation is available whenever you are ready. Naomi looked toward the limousine outside, then toward her apartment. The familiar walls, the old furniture, the life she understood. Everything beyond that limousine felt uncertain. Gloria touched her shoulder. You spent your whole life showing up for other people, she said. Maybe it is time to see where that kindness leads. Naomi folded the note carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. She took a deep breath. Yesterday she had walked away from the future she thought she wanted. Today, a completely different future seemed to be waiting outside her front door. And for the first time since leaving the ballroom, she felt something stronger than confusion. Curiosity. Naomi spent most of the drive staring out the limousine window. Charleston moved past. In slow, familiar images. Small restaurants opening for lunch. Families walking along sidewalks. Delivery trucks making morning stops. Yet the farther the limousine traveled, the more unfamiliar everything became. Modest neighborhoods gave way to waterfront estates. Busy streets became quiet private roads lined with ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Eventually the limousine turned through a set of wrought iron gates and followed a winding driveway overlooking Charleston Harbor. Naomi had seen homes like this only in magazines. Even then, they never felt real. The estate sat above the water, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens and sweeping views of the harbor. The limousine came to a gentle stop. Thomas stepped out and opened the door. We have arrived. Naomi took a slow breath and stepped outside. The air smelled of salt water and fresh-cut grass. Everything around her felt calm, deliberate, the kind of peace money could create but not necessarily buy. A woman greeted her at the entrance and guided her through the house. Naomi expected displays of wealth. She found them, but she also noticed something else. Bookshelves filled with worn novels. Framed family photographs. Handwritten notes pinned beside a calendar. The home felt lived in, personal, human. Eventually they arrived at a quiet study overlooking the harbor. Large windows stretched from floor to ceiling, filling the room with sunlight. Edward Harrington stood beside the glass, looking out at the water. When he turned and saw her, a genuine smile appeared on his face. Miss Brooks. Naomi nodded politely. Mr. Harrington. Edward motioned toward a small table where coffee and pastries had been arranged. Please, seat. Naomi noticed one of the coffee cups had already gone cold. He had clearly been waiting. They sat across from one another. For several moments neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. Felt thoughtful. Finally Edward leaned forward slightly. I never properly thanked you. Naomi immediately shook her head. You do not owe me anything. Edward smiled faintly. That is where we disagree. He glanced toward the harbor before continuing. Most people protect what matters most to them. Yesterday you walked away from it. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. The memory still felt complicated. Edward studied her expression carefully. Do you regret your decision? The question lingered between them. Naomi thought about the wedding, Daniel, Gloria, the uncertainty waiting back home. Then she answered honestly. I regret that people were hurt. Her voice softened. But I do not regret helping. Edward sat quietly for a moment. Then he nodded. Not because the answer surprised him, because it confirmed what he already suspected. Character like hers could not be manufactured. It revealed itself only when sacrifice became necessary. He reached toward a folder resting on the table beside him. Naomi noticed the movement immediately. Whatever was inside that folder seemed important. Edward placed it between them and rested one hand on top of it. "There is something I would like to discuss with you," he said. Naomi looked at the folder, then back at him. For the first time since entering the estate, she felt nervous. Because something in Edward's expression suggested this conversation was about far more than gratitude. Edward slowly opened the folder and turned it toward Naomi. She expected documents related to the hotel. Perhaps paperwork connected to insurance or some formal expression of gratitude. Instead, she found photographs, community centers, scholarship programs, food assistance projects, youth mentorship initiatives. The pages were filled with stories of people whose lives had been changed through charitable work. Naomi looked up, confused. "What is this?" Edward smiled slightly. "A problem." Naomi blinked. "That looks like a lot more than one problem." For the first time that morning, Edward laughed. The sound surprised both of them. "Fair point." He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Several years ago, I created a foundation. It supports communities across the country. On paper, it is successful. It reaches thousands of people every year." Naomi looked down at the folder again. "That sounds like a good thing." "It is." Edward paused. "But somewhere along the way, it became very good at measuring numbers and not always good at understanding people." Naomi listened quietly. Outside the study windows, sunlight danced across the harbor. Sailboats moved slowly across the water. The calm scenery contrasted sharply with the unexpected conversation unfolding inside. Edward continued, "For years I have searched for people who understand service, sacrifice, and responsibility. Not because they studied those words, because they lived them." Naomi lowered her eyes. She was beginning to understand where the conversation was heading, and it made her uncomfortable. "Mr. Harrington?" "Edward," he corrected gently. "Edward." Naomi nodded. "I am just a waitress." Edward immediately shook his head. "No. You are a woman who walked away from the most important day of her life to help a complete stranger." Naomi looked toward the harbor. Compliments always made her uneasy. Anyone should have done the same thing. Edward smiled sadly. "The older I get, the less convinced I am of that." He slid another document from the folder. This one described a leadership fellowship connected to the foundation. Training programs, community development projects, travel opportunities, mentorship. Naomi stared at the pages. The opportunity felt unreal. "Why are you showing me this?" Edward answered without hesitation. "Because I think you belong there." Silence filled the room. Naomi looked down at the proposal, then back at Edward, then back at the proposal again. Finally, she closed the folder. Edward noticed immediately. "You do not seem excited." Naomi smiled faintly. "I am trying to figure out whether this is real." "It is." She looked directly at him. "Then let me ask you something." Edward leaned forward. "All right." Naomi folded her hands. "If I had known who you were at the hotel, and helped because I expected something in return, would I be sitting here today?" The question caught him completely off guard. For several moments he said nothing. Then a slow smile appeared on his face. "No, Naomi Navid." "Then how do you know this opportunity is not changing the reason I helped?" Edward studied her carefully. Most people accepted opportunities immediately. Most people never challenged them. Yet Naomi was questioning the very thing others would chase. At that moment, Edward became even more certain than before. Because the one thing he could not teach was character. And the woman sitting across from him had just proven she possessed it in abundance. Edward did not ask Naomi for an answer that day. Instead, he closed the folder and smiled. "Take your time," he said. "The opportunity will still be there tomorrow." Naomi appreciated that more than he realized. Throughout her life, most difficult choices had arrived with pressure attached. This one arrived with respect. Later that afternoon, the limousine carried her back across Charleston. The harbor disappeared behind her. The familiar streets returned. Yet something inside her had changed. For the first time, she could see possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. That evening she sat with Gloria on the apartment balcony and told her everything. The fellowship, the conversation, the question she could not stop asking herself. Gloria listened quietly before looking toward the sunset. Sometimes life closes one door because it knows you are meant to walk through another. Naomi smiled. The words stayed with her long after the conversation ended. The following morning, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to Daniel. They met beside Charleston Harbor, the same place where he had proposed years earlier. The water was calm. Seagulls drifted overhead. They spoke honestly about the wedding, about the future, and about the different paths now unfolding before them. There was sadness, but there was also understanding. By the time they parted, neither carried anger. Only gratitude for the years they had shared. The second call was to Edward Harrington. When he answered, Naomi took a deep breath. "I would like to accept the fellowship," she said. A smile spread across Edward's face. "I was hoping you would." Months passed. Naomi traveled to communities she never expected to visit. She helped develop local programs, listened to families facing challenges, and worked beside people who believed service mattered more than status. The work was demanding, meaningful, transformative. One afternoon during a foundation event overlooking Charleston Harbor, Edward handed her a small box. Inside rested a carefully preserved ivory flower from her wedding bouquet. Naomi looked up in surprise. Edward smiled gently. Some choices deserve to be remembered. Naomi held the flower carefully and looked out across the water. The sunlight shimmered across the harbor just as it had on the day everything changed. She once believed she had lost her future. Now she understood something deeper. She had simply discovered a different one. A future built not on a single ceremony, but on the values that guided every decision she made. In the end, the greatest gift was never the fellowship, the limousine, or the opportunity. It was the reminder that character reveals itself when kindness becomes inconvenient. And sometimes the smallest act for a stranger becomes the first step toward the life you were always meant to live.